Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Dorothy Mae Washington. Not the Dorothy who shows up in the society pages of Atlanta magazine, the one in the tailored suit cutting ribbons at new community centers. Not the Dorothy whose name is engraved on a wing of Grady Memorial Hospital, or whose company logo appears on half the commercial buildings lining Peachtree Street. I want you to meet the Dorothy who stood in a church dressing room on a Tuesday morning in October, fastening the buttons of a deep burgundy blazer, the color her late husband Leonard always said made her look like a real queen, not a pretend one, and tried to remember the last time her son had called her just to talk. Not to ask for something, just to talk. She couldn't remember. Outside the window of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta had dressed itself in autumn gold. Leaves the color of amber and rust tumbled down the broad avenues of Buckhead, the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. Inside, the smell of gardenias and fresh linen drifted up from the reception hall 2 floors below, where florists were finishing arrangements that had cost more per centerpiece than Dorothy's first car. She had paid for all of it. Every rose, every candle, every plate of herb-crusted salmon and truffle risotto for 230 guests. $265,000. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone except her assistant, Brianna Holloway, who had processed the payments with her usual quiet efficiency in the single comment, "Bless your heart, Dorothy, the real kind." A knock at the door. "Mrs. Washington?" Brianna's voice, warm and steady as always. "Elijah's asking for you, 20 minutes to the ceremony. Tell him I'm coming." Dorothy opened the small silver locket she kept in her purse, not to check the time, but because inside was a photograph barely larger than a postage stamp. Leonard at 42, laughing at something off camera, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead the way he always wore them when he was excited about an idea. "How does he look?" she whispered. She already knew the answer. She had seen Elijah in his tuxedo an hour ago, and her chest had nearly cracked open with pride. He looked exactly like his father at 33. The same strong jaw, the same shoulders, the same way of standing like he was about to say something important. She just hoped he was ready to mean it. She closed the locket, checked the burgundy blazer one final time, and walked out to marry off her only son. What Dorothy did not allow herself to think about, not in the dressing room, not during the ceremony, not during the first hour of cocktail reception at Capital City Club, one of the oldest private clubs in the American South, the kind of place that had been deciding who mattered since 1883, was the feeling she had been carrying for 18 months like a stone in her coat pocket. The distance. It hadn't happened all at once. It had happened the way a good painting fades, slowly, in ways you only notice when you compare it to how it used to look. Elijah called less. His voicemails were shorter. When she visited his apartment in Midtown, he was always just about to head out. When she suggested Sunday dinners, there was always a prior engagement with Savannah's family, or a work trip, or a friend's birthday. She had told herself it was natural. He was building a new life. He was in love. She remembered what it felt like to be newly in love with Leonard. The whole world contracted to just the two of you, and everything else, including people who loved you, had to wait patiently at the edges. But there was something else, something she hadn't been able to name until the engagement dinner 6 months ago, when she had met Savannah Caldwell Pierce's family for the first time. Savannah herself was beautiful in the way that expensive upbringings produce, effortlessly put together, quick with a smile, socially fluent in the particular dialect of old Atlanta money. Dorothy had watched her move through the restaurant that evening and thought, this girl has never been told no by anyone she cared to impress. Then Savannah had looked around Dorothy's living room, the one with the original Carrie James Marshall canvas above the fireplace and the Kehinde Wiley portrait near the hallway, and said with complete natural confidence, "Mrs. Washington, I know the most wonderful interior designer. She completely transformed my parents' guest wing. I think she could really refresh this space for you." There was a beat of silence. "That's very thoughtful of you," Dorothy had said pleasantly. "Those 2 paintings on the wall are by Carrie James Marshall and Kehinde Wiley. I bought them directly from their galleries in 1997 and 1999, but I'm always open to a second opinion." Savannah had smiled and moved on to another topic, as people do when a conversational grenade fails to detonate the way they intended. But Dorothy had kept the moment, filed it away, not out of bitterness, out of information gathering. 30 years in commercial real estate had taught her that the most important data points were the ones people didn't realize they were providing. Capital City Club had been established in 1883, and it looked it, in the best possible way. Dark wood paneling, portraits of serious men in serious clothes, chandeliers that had witnessed 100 years of Atlanta society doing what Atlanta society always did, deciding very quietly who mattered and who did not. Dorothy sat at the family table and felt for the first time that day the particular loneliness of being the most important person in a room where no one knew it yet. The Caldwell family had taken over the evening with the casual authority of people who had been taking over evenings their entire lives. George Caldwell III, silver-haired, square-jawed, the kind of handsome that came from 3 generations of good nutrition and 0 financial stress, held court near the bar with the effortless confidence of a man who had never once questioned his right to take up space. Vivian Caldwell floated between tables in a gown that probably cost more than some people's mortgages, dispensing air kisses and curated warmth like a woman who had trained for this specific performance since finishing school. And their friends, lawyers, developers, a state senator, 2 former SEC commissioners, laughed too loudly at each other's jokes and clinked glasses, and did not once glance toward the table where Dorothy sat in her burgundy blazer, watching everything. She had been introduced to several of them during cocktail hour. The interactions followed a predictable pattern: warm handshake, brief pleasantry, rapid reassessment when they realized she wasn't associated with any name they recognized, polite withdrawal. She was used to it. She had been navigating these rooms her whole adult life. Rooms that were not built for women who looked like her, that had not expected her, that had not left a place at the table and required her to bring her own chair. She had carried her own chair into so many rooms that she barely noticed the weight anymore. What she was not entirely prepared for was Savannah. It happened at 7:43 in the evening, according to the delicate gold watch on Dorothy's wrist, the one Leonard had given her on their 20th anniversary, the last one before he got sick. Savannah had been drinking champagne since the ceremony, not recklessly, but consistently, in the way of a woman who knew exactly how to maintain a specific level of social confidence. She was radiant in her wedding gown, flushed with the particular triumph of a day that had gone exactly as planned, surrounded by her closest friends who formed a moving constellation around her wherever she went in the room. She led them now toward the family table. Dorothy saw her coming and composed her face into something warm and open. "And here," Savannah said, her voice carrying easily above the jazz quartet, "is Mrs. Washington, Elijah's mother." She paused, champagne flute tilting slightly in her hand, and smiled at her friends with the expression of someone about to share a charming detail. She used to be a school teacher, bless her heart. Now, for those of you not from the American South, that phrase needs a moment. Bless her heart. 3 words that, in the particular dialect of Southern womanhood, land like a silk glove over a closed fist. It sounds like sympathy. It is not sympathy. Savannah continued. Elijah always says she does her best with what she has. The laughter was light, brief, the kind that passes quickly in a room and leaves behind something that doesn't. Vivian stood 2 feet away, wearing a smile so finely calibrated it revealed nothing. George, nearby, glanced at Dorothy for exactly 1 second, the assessment of a man who had already decided something wasn't worth his attention, and looked away. Dorothy did not move. 63 years had taught her this. The most powerful response to a grenade is to let it land without flinching, and then keep walking. She looked at Savannah, really looked at her, calmly, the way she looked at a balance sheet when she suspected something was wrong, but wanted to be absolutely certain before she acted, and smiled. "What a wonderful evening," she said. "You look beautiful, Savannah, truly." And she meant it. The girl was beautiful. That wasn't the problem. The laughter faded. The constellation of friends drifted toward the bar. Vivian said something to George. Elijah appeared at Dorothy's elbow, his best man Todd Pemberton a half step behind him, both of them wearing the expression of men who sensed tension without knowing its source. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm perfectly fine, sweetheart." She patted his arm. "Go be with your wife. This is your night." She watched him hesitate, watched him make the small but irreversible choice to accept the easy answer, and then turn back toward Savannah. Dorothy picked up her water glass and took a long, slow sip. The powder room on the 2nd floor had a vanity with a long mirror framed in brass, and Dorothy locked the door behind her and stood in front of it for a moment. Burgundy blazer. Good pearls. Real ones, from the set she had bought herself the year Washington Legacy Group crossed $100 million in assets. Makeup perfect, the kind that required skill and patience to look effortless. shoulders straight from decades of practice. She looked at herself for a long moment. Then she opened her purse, took out her phone, and called Brianna. "Is everything all right?" Brianna answered on the second ring. "Pull the full Caldwell and Pierce file for me. I need it on my desk before 9 o'clock Monday morning." A pause. Brianna knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. "Already on it," she said. Dorothy hung up, reapplied her lipstick, and walked back downstairs to enjoy her son's wedding. She did not go back to the table immediately. Instead, she found a quiet corner near the windows overlooking Peachtree Street, and she allowed herself 5 minutes, just 5, to feel what she had been carrying in that coat pocket for 18 months. She thought about Leonard. Leonard Washington had been the kind of man who made everyone around him feel like the most important person in the room. Not as a technique, because he was genuinely, constitutionally curious about people in a way that never diminished. He had been an engineer by training, a builder by temperament, and a dreamer by nature, and the combination had produced, in 1989, a small company called Washington Legacy Group that bought and renovated distressed commercial properties in underserved Atlanta neighborhoods. By the time Elijah was born, the company had 3 employees and a modest portfolio. By the time Elijah started school, it had 12 employees and was expanding into Tennessee. And then, in the spring of 2004, Leonard had sat down across from Dorothy in the kitchen of their home in southwest Atlanta and told her, very calmly, very quietly, in the voice he reserved for things that required absolute clarity, that the doctors had found something in his pancreas. "Tell me the plan," Dorothy had said, because with Leonard, there was always a plan. "The plan is that you're going to be okay," he had said. "Both of you. I need you to know that." He was gone 9 months later. The note he left, a single sheet of yellow legal paper in his handwriting folded inside the company's original partnership documents, said simply, "You know how to do this. You always have. You just haven't believed it yet." Dorothy had believed it. She had walked into the first bank meeting alone at 44 years old, a former schoolteacher with a dead husband's portfolio and 52 pages of financial analysis she had written herself at the kitchen table after Elijah went to bed. She had sat across from a loan officer who looked at her like she was a pleasant surprise that wouldn't pan out, and she had been so calm and so precise and so thoroughly prepared that he approved the loan before she finished her 3rd presentation slide. She had cried in the car afterward. 10 minutes, alone in a parking garage. Then she had wiped her face, driven to the construction site, and gotten to work. That was 2005. Now it was 2024, and Washington Legacy Group held title to 43 commercial properties across Georgia and Tennessee, employed 217 people, and was valued, conservatively, at just over $400 million. And her son's new wife thought she did her best with what she had. Dorothy finished her 5 minutes, straightened her shoulders, went back to the table. The moment that changed everything happened at 9:17 in the evening, near the dessert station. George Caldwell III was in the middle of a story about a waterfront development deal when he paused mid-sentence and looked across the room. He had looked at Dorothy twice that evening without seeing her. This was the 3rd look, and it was different. This time, something behind his eyes shifted. He excused himself from his group and crossed the room with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to being watched as he moved and stopped in front of Dorothy. "Forgive me," he said, his voice lowered. "Are you D.M. Washington, the Washington Legacy Group?" Dorothy set down her dessert fork. "I'm Dorothy Washington," she said. "Yes." George Caldwell III went very still, and Dorothy watched, with the patient attention of a woman who had spent 3 decades reading rooms, as the full weight of the situation settled onto his shoulders like a coat made of lead. Because what George knew, and what Dorothy had known for 6 weeks, was this. Caldwell and Pierce Real Estate Group, the company George's grandfather had founded, that his father had expanded, and that George had been running for 22 years, was in serious trouble. 3 consecutive quarters of losses, driven by a spectacularly ill-timed investment in a mixed-use development in Midtown that had stalled in permitting delays and hemorrhaged carrying costs for 18 months. 2 of their largest anchor tenants had declined to renew. Their credit lines were at 80% capacity. The board of directors, quietly, without informing George until it was done, had reached out to Washington Legacy Group 2 months ago about a strategic partnership, a real one, operational oversight, spending authority above $500,000, a formal advisory role with genuine decision-making power. George had signed the agreement 3 weeks ago. He had not told his family because the specific geometry of his pride would not allow him to announce that he needed help, and certainly not help from someone whose full name he hadn't bothered to learn. The name on the agreement had been D.M. Washington. Dorothy had read the file 6 weeks ago and understood immediately, with the clarity of someone who processes information without the interference of ego, exactly what this meant. She had said nothing to anyone except Raymond Okafor, her attorney, and Brianna. She had attended her son's wedding and sat at the family table and been called a charity case in front of 200 people. And she had waited. Now she looked at George Caldwell III and said quietly enough that no one else could hear, "Come to my office Monday morning, George, 9 o'clock. We have a great deal to discuss." George opened his mouth, closed it. "My assistant will confirm the address," Dorothy said pleasantly. "Enjoy the rest of the evening." She picked up her dessert fork and returned to her plate. Elijah found her near the coat check at 10:30, just as she was preparing to leave. "Mom," he looked unsettled in a way that the champagne hadn't caused. "Savannah's dad looked like he saw a ghost. What happened?" "We had a lovely conversation," Dorothy said, accepting her wrap from the attendant. "I'm headed home. Walk me out?" They stood on the steps of Capital City Club while her car was brought around, the October air cool and clean. "Are you okay?" Elijah asked. "Really?" Dorothy looked at her son. This man she had raised alone through grief and financial terror and 20 years of 7 a.m. alarm clocks. This man she had put through Howard undergraduate and Emory for his MBA. This man she had given everything to because that was what you did when you loved someone. And she saw in the way he was standing that he had positioned himself very slightly facing the club doors, as if part of him was already back inside. "I'm wonderful, sweetheart," she said. "Go back to your wife. We'll talk soon." His relief came faster than his concern had. She noticed that, too. In the car, she called Brianna one more time. "The Caldwell and Pierce file," she said. "I also need the full personnel roster. Benefits packages, salary structures, everything." "Dorothy," Brianna said. She only used the first name when something was important. "Are you sure about this?" "I've been sure for 6 weeks," Dorothy said. "I was just being polite." She looked out the window as Atlanta moved past, the lights of Buckhead giving way to the quieter neighborhoods to the south, the ones she had grown up in, the ones Leonard's company, her company, had invested in when no one else would. "You know how to do this," Leonard had written. She was about to prove it again. She got home at 11:15. She didn't turn on the lights right away. She stood in the hallway of the house she had lived in for 31 years and listened to the silence and let it be what it was. Then she went to Leonard's study, sat in his chair, and opened the Caldwell and Pierce file. She read until 2 in the morning. Savannah called 3 times on Sunday. Dorothy knew because Brianna had set up a secondary line for Washington Legacy Group's executive communications, and Dorothy had given that number, not her personal one, to George at the wedding, which meant the 3 calls that came to her personal phone on Sunday were from Savannah directly, which meant Elijah had given her the number, which meant Elijah knew something had shifted, even if he didn't yet know what. The first call came at 11 in the morning. Dorothy was at her kitchen table with the Caldwell and Pierce personnel file, a yellow legal pad, and the second cup of coffee she allowed herself on Sundays. She let it go to voicemail. "Mrs. Washington, this is Savannah, Elijah's wife." A pause, as if she was reminding herself of the new title. "I'm calling because I think perhaps there was some confusion last night, and I'd love to connect and clear the air. Please do call me back when you have a moment." Dorothy listened to it once, set the phone face down on the table, and returned to the personnel file. 47 employees at Caldwell and Pierce had lost their full health insurance coverage in a cost-cutting initiative in 2021. Of those 47, 4 were currently managing serious medical conditions, 2 with cancer diagnoses, 1 with type 1 diabetes, 1 recovering from a cardiac event the previous spring. She wrote the number 47 on her legal pad and underlined it twice. The second call came at 3 in the afternoon, while Dorothy was in Leonard's study going through the Caldwell and Pierce financial projections. "Mrs. Washington, it's Savannah again. I want to make sure we haven't gotten off on the wrong foot. I think I may have said some things last night that came out differently than I intended, and I really do hope we can have a fresh start. I'm sure we'll be spending a great deal of time together as family, and I think it's so important that we—" The voicemail cut off at the time limit. Dorothy noticed that in 2 minutes and 40 seconds of carefully chosen words, Savannah had not once said, "I'm sorry," or identified anything specific she had said or done. She noted this, filed it. The third call came at 7:30 in the evening, just as Dorothy had settled into Leonard's armchair with a small glass of bourbon, his brand, the bottle she kept on the shelf, and opened only when she needed to think clearly, because the smell of it alone put her back in the room with him, and the last 50 pages of the Caldwell and Pierce analysis. This time she answered, "Mrs. Washington." Savannah's voice was different, less prepared, something underneath the composure that hadn't been there in the earlier calls. "Thank you for picking up." "Good evening, Savannah." A beat. "I want to apologize," Savannah said, "for what I said last night." Dorothy waited. In 22 years of board meetings and contract negotiations, she had learned that silence was the most efficient way to determine whether someone was apologizing or performing an apology. "The comment I made, about you doing your best with what you have," another pause. "That was unkind. It was thoughtless, and it was wrong, and I'm sorry." It was better. Not perfect. There was still no acknowledgement of the specific phrase, "bless her heart," of the audience Savannah had chosen, of the theater of it. But it was better than the first 2 attempts. There was something real in it, some friction of genuine discomfort that hadn't been there before. "I appreciate you calling, Savannah," Dorothy said. "That took courage. I'm not sure I deserve credit for courage when I had very good reasons to call." Dorothy paused at that. It was an unexpectedly honest thing to say. "No," she agreed. "But you said it anyway. That counts for something." She could hear Savannah exhale. "Mrs. Washington, can I ask you something?" "You can." "What Elijah said, about you doing your best, I need to understand." A long pause. "Did he know? When he said those things to me, did he know what Washington Legacy Group actually is?" The question landed differently than Dorothy expected, because in it was something she hadn't fully considered from Savannah's direction. The possibility that the young woman on the other end of this phone was also in some way a person who had been deceived. "What exactly did Elijah tell you about me?" Dorothy asked. "Not last night, over the past 2 years. What did he tell you?" The silence that followed was the longest yet, and then Savannah told her. It came out in pieces, with the halting quality of someone dismantling something they had believed in and finding the structure unsound. Elijah had told Savannah that his mother had been a school teacher for most of her career, that after his father died, she had taken over some small property management, his father's little business, nothing major, that she had done well enough, all things considered, but that she didn't really understand modern business, the way things worked now, the scale of what the Caldwell family dealt with. He had told her that Dorothy had trouble letting go, that she had always treated him more like a project than a son, and that she used financial help to stay involved in his life when he wanted to be independent. He had told her that Dorothy would probably try to insert herself into their marriage, into their decisions, into their finances, and that Savannah should feel empowered to hold firm on boundaries. He had told her these things over 2 years of dinners and weekend trips and late-night conversations, in the way that information delivered gradually and consistently becomes the texture of what you believe, until you can no longer remember learning it. You simply know it, the way you know the layout of a house you have lived in long enough. Dorothy listened to all of it without interrupting. When Savannah finished, there was a long quiet on the line. "Mrs. Washington, I'm sorry," Savannah said again. And this time it was different. Smaller, stripped down to something unperformed. "I repeated those things, to my friends, to my parents. He described you as someone who needed to be managed, and I believed him, because I had no reason not to." "You had no reason not to," Dorothy said carefully. "You had met me twice." "Yes." "And he was your fiancé." "Yes." "So you trusted his account." "I did." A breath. "I shouldn't have formed an opinion without getting to know you myself. I know that now." Dorothy stood and walked to the window of Leonard's study. The neighborhood was quiet. The old oak in the front yard, the one Elijah used to climb when he was 7, the one Leonard had threatened every fall to cut down and never did, stood in the October dark, the last of its leaves just beginning to let go. "Savannah," she said, "thank you for this conversation. I mean that." "What happens now?" "Now I think about what you've told me, and I think you should do the same." She ended the call and stood at the window for a long time. Her son had spent 2 years building a version of her, smaller, less capable, more dependent, more intrusive, and had placed that version in his new family's hands like a set of instructions. Here is who she is. Here is how to handle her. It was not an accident. It was not carelessness. It was architecture. The question she carried into bed that night and woke with at 5 a.m. was not what to do about it. She already knew what to do. The question was why. Why would Elijah, a man she had loved and supported and championed at every turning point of his life, need to build that particular architecture? What was he hiding behind it? She didn't have the answer yet, but in her experience, when you found a false wall in a structure, you didn't knock it down immediately. You studied it first. You figured out what it was holding up. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Dorothy walked into the offices of Caldwell and Pierce Real Estate Group on the 32nd floor of One Atlantic Center wearing a charcoal gray suit, pearl earrings, the small ones, not the statement pair, and the particular expression she reserved for rooms where the power dynamic had not yet been made explicit. George was already there. So was the company's CFO, Arthur Bellingham, who looked like he hadn't slept, and their corporate attorney, Patricia Weston, who had the careful, controlled affect of someone professionally trained to reveal nothing. Dorothy set her briefcase on the table, opened it, and removed a bound report she placed in front of George without comment. 88 pages, custom tabs, her company's logo on the cover, and below it, Caldwell and Pierce Real Estate Group, Operational Assessment, Q1 to Q3 2024. She let him open it. Let him turn to the first summary page. Let him read the first 3 lines. Then she said pleasantly, "Your company is losing $2.1 million per quarter. You have 3 buildings operating at under 60% capacity. 2 long-term leases expire in April, and both tenants have already notified your property managers they will not be renewing. Your credit facilities are at 83% utilization." George looked up. His jaw was set in this way of a man who had decided that dignity required stillness. "We're aware of the challenges." "I'm sure you are. What I'd like to discuss this morning is the difference between being aware of challenges and having a plan to address them." She turned to a tab near the middle of the report. "Your 3 underperforming properties are all in corridors where market rents have increased between 18 and 24% since 2021. You're charging 2019 rates to long-term tenants, and while I understand the relationship logic behind that, the practical effect is that you're subsidizing successful businesses at your own company's expense." "Those relationships took decades to build," George said. "I know. I've read the history." She said it without condescension. "And I'm not suggesting you end them. I'm suggesting you have honest conversations with those tenants about market reality. Conversations you've been avoiding because they're uncomfortable. Uncomfortable and necessary are not mutually exclusive." Arthur Bellingham shifted in his seat and said nothing. Patricia Weston wrote something on her notepad. George looked at Dorothy with the expression of a man beginning to understand the terrain. "Mrs. Washington, I'd like to understand the scope of your role here. The agreement my board signed gives Washington Legacy Group operational oversight and co-signatory authority on expenditures above $500,000. Dorothy said it the way she said all precise things, without inflection, the way math works. "That is the scope of my role. I'm not here to manage your company, George. I'm here to make sure the decisions that get made are the right ones. And if I disagree with your assessment, then we discuss it. I'm not unreasonable." Almost a smile. "I'm just prepared." A pause. George looked at the report again. "What do you want from us?" he said. And for the first time that morning, it sounded less like a negotiating position and more like a genuine question. Dorothy had been waiting for that shift. She outlined 3 things. First, the employee benefits restructuring. 47 people had lost comprehensive health coverage in 2021. She had already been in contact with 3 benefits providers. The cost to restore full coverage to all 200 employees would be approximately $1.8 million annually, offset by reducing the executive compensation structure, which was currently arranged in ways that would not survive scrutiny if the company ever went through an acquisition or audit. George's expression at executive compensation structure told her he understood exactly what she was referring to. Second, a 90-day operational review of all properties, conducted jointly by her team and his, with the goal of identifying which assets were performing, which were salvageable, and which needed to be repositioned. No panic moves, no reactive sales before the review was complete. Third, She wanted Elijah Washington hired as Deputy Director of Project Development. Effective the following Wednesday. George blinked. Your son. My son has an MBA from Emory and 5 years of consulting experience in commercial real estate development. He's better than you'd expect. Mrs. Washington, with respect, hiring your son in the current situation. This is not a favor to my son, Dorothy said. This is an opportunity for my son to prove that he can stand on his own without standing on my money. There's a difference. And frankly, it's an opportunity I should have created for him a long time ago. She said it without self-pity, without drama. The way she said all true things, but something in it silenced the room. He'll be evaluated the same as any other employee, she continued. If he performs, he keeps the position. If he doesn't, he goes. I won't intervene either way. George looked at her for a long moment. You do that? For your own son? I'd do it for my own son, Dorothy said. Whether he sees it that way is up to him. Vivian Caldwell called on Wednesday and asked Dorothy to lunch. Dorothy recognized the move immediately. The same move George had made on Monday, scaled for a different setting and a different set of social tools. Where George had used the language of business to find leverage, Vivian would use the language of family. She agreed to meet. The Biltmore Ballroom, noon on Thursday. Vivian arrived 4 minutes early in a cream-colored dress that was understated in the precise way that requires a significant amount of money. She embraced Dorothy at the table with the warmth of a woman greeting a close friend she had known for years. Dorothy accepted it graciously and sat down. They ordered. The server left. Vivian discussed the restaurant, the weather, the wedding flowers. Beautiful, weren't they? And Dorothy answered pleasantly and waited. She waited through the appetizers. She waited through the first half of the main course. Then Vivian set down her fork and said, Dorothy, I want to address what's been happening. George came home Monday very unsettled. Savannah is worried. And I think, as family, we should be able to talk honestly about what we all actually want. What situation would that be? Dorothy asked. The changes you're proposing at the company are quite significant. George has run that business for over 2 decades, and I think it's natural that he'd want some time to... Vivian, Dorothy said it gently, not sharply. How many of your husband's employees lost their health insurance in 2021? A flicker. Just a flicker, but Dorothy caught it. I'm not involved in the day-to-day. 47 people. 4 of them are dealing with serious medical conditions right now. One woman, she has been with the company for 16 years. She is managing her cancer treatment on a plan that doesn't cover the medication her oncologist recommends. Vivian was very still. I didn't know that, she said quietly. No, I don't imagine you did. Dorothy took a sip of water. I'm not saying this to embarrass you or George. I'm saying it because these are the things that look invisible from inside a certain kind of life, and I need you to understand that when I make changes to that company, it isn't to disrupt your family. It's because some things need to change. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and Dorothy gave her credit for this, because it was harder than most things said to her that week. What do you need from us, Dorothy? Honestly. Honestly? I need your daughter to finish what she started Sunday night. Not the first 2 calls, the third one. That version of Savannah I'd like to see more of. Dorothy said it without unkindness. And I need your husband to trust the process long enough to see that what I'm doing isn't punishment. It's just good business. Can the company be saved? Yes, Dorothy said simply. That's why I agreed to the partnership. I wouldn't have taken this on if I didn't believe it could work. Something released in Vivian's posture. Subtle, but there. Dorothy paid the check for both of them, without making it a gesture, the way she did all things that didn't require an audience. And she walked out into the Atlanta afternoon thinking about one phrase. Bad information from someone she trusted. Because she still hadn't answered her own question about the false wall. She still didn't know what Elijah was hiding behind it. She found out 2 days later. Todd Pemberton called on a Saturday morning from a number Dorothy didn't recognize at 7:15. She answered because she always answered numbers she didn't recognize. In her experience, the calls that came from unknown numbers at unexpected hours were the ones that mattered. Mrs. Washington. The voice was young, male, careful. The voice of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say but was no longer sure it was enough. My name is Todd Pemberton. I'm Elijah's friend. We were roommates at Emory. I was his best man at the wedding. I remember you, Todd, Dorothy said. I'm calling because I've been trying to figure out if this is the right thing to do for about 3 weeks now, and I've run out of reasons why it isn't. Dorothy sat down. Tell me, she said. It came out in layers, the way structural damage reveals itself when you start looking carefully at a building everyone assumed was sound. Layer 1. Elijah had lost his position at the consulting firm almost a year before the wedding. Not a layoff, not a restructuring. He had been let go after a client submitted a formal complaint. A presentation Elijah delivered had contained analysis built on selectively interpreted data. The client lost a significant contract as a result. The firm released him without severance. He had told no one, not Savannah, not Dorothy. Only Todd, who had found out because Elijah called him from a parking garage at midnight, 2 weeks after it happened, and told him everything. Layer 2. In the months between losing his job and the wedding, Elijah had maintained the complete appearance of employment. He told Savannah he was transitioning to a better opportunity. He kept his morning schedule, left the apartment in business clothes, and spent his days at coffee shops and the public library, submitting applications and managing a level of financial panic he had no vocabulary to admit to anyone he loved. Layer 3. His savings were gone within 3 months. After that, he borrowed, some from Todd, some from other friends, in small amounts that added up. He put the engagement ring on a high-interest payment plan. He stopped making full payments on his car loan. And when Dorothy offered to pay for the wedding, Elijah said yes, not out of ingratitude, but because without that money, the entire constructed reality of his life would have collapsed publicly, in front of Savannah's family, in front of everyone whose opinion he had decided mattered most. He was drowning, Todd said. And instead of telling anyone, he just kept swimming harder and hoped no one could tell. Dorothy was quiet. I think, Todd said it carefully, he needed you to seem smaller so no one would look too closely at him. If they were busy underestimating you, they weren't watching him. Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment. The false wall. Now she could see what it was holding up. Thank you, Todd, she said. This took real courage. Is he going to be okay? She thought about that honestly before she answered. He has a chance to be, she said. That's the most honest answer I can give you. She hung up and sat very still in Leonard's chair for a long time. She had moved through anger somewhere in the long middle of that phone call and come out the other side into something colder and more clarifying. The specific grief of understanding exactly how you have been failed by someone you refuse to stop believing in. She had a dinner to plan, and a conversation that was far too long overdue. She called Elijah that evening and invited him and Savannah for dinner on Friday night. Her house, 7 o'clock, just the 3 of them. He said yes quickly, too quickly, with the eagerness of someone hoping a nice dinner might smooth over whatever he could sense was coming. She spent the rest of the week doing 3 things. She finalized the first phase of the Caldwell and Pierce restructuring plan, which Brianna helped prepare in a format ready for the board presentation scheduled for the following Tuesday. She reviewed the personnel files of George's family members on the company payroll, noting carefully what each of them actually did versus what their job titles suggested. And she called Raymond Okafor on Thursday afternoon, not to take any action yet, but to understand her options. Because Dorothy Mae Washington did not walk into rooms unprepared. Not in 2005 when the banker looked at her like a pleasant surprise that wouldn't pan out. Not ever. On Friday morning she cooked. Not catered, not ordered. Cooked. The slow kind that fills a house with something that smells like history. Braised short ribs. Roasted root vegetables. Cornbread from her mother's recipe, written on an index card in her mother's handwriting that she kept in the kitchen drawer and had never typed out. Because some things needed to stay handwritten. She set the table with the good dishes. The wedding china she and Leonard had chosen together in 1988 that she used perhaps 5 times a year. Elijah and Savannah arrived at 7. Elijah wore the careful expression of a man who had decided everything was probably fine and was committed to that decision regardless of evidence. Savannah was quieter, more watchful, less performed. Dorothy had noticed in the 2 conversations she had now had with Savannah that the girl had layers she had been too busy performing confidence to show. She was sharper than she let on, and more uncertain than she pretended, and underneath both of those things, genuinely trying to understand a situation that had turned out to be more complicated than her wedding planning binder had accounted for. Dorothy could work with genuinely trying. She fed them first. That was important. Her mother had taught her, you don't have the hard conversations on empty stomachs. The body needs to feel cared for before it can bear being honest. When the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, Dorothy folded her hands on the table and looked at her son. "Elijah," she said, "tell me about the consulting firm." The color left his face so quickly it was almost medical. "Mom, tell me what happened. All of it. I want to hear it from you." Savannah went very still. Elijah looked at his wife, then at his mother, then at the table. And Dorothy watched him make the calculation she had watched him make his whole life, the one where he decided whether the cost of honesty was higher than the cost of the alternative. This time, for the first time in a very long time, he chose the truth. He talked for 47 minutes. Dorothy knew because she had glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece when he began. The small brass carriage clock Leonard had bought at an estate sale in 1996, the one that had sat in the same spot for 28 years. And she glanced at it again when he stopped. 47 minutes of the kind of talking that leaves a person emptied out, the way a house looks after a storm has passed through and taken everything that wasn't nailed down. He told them about the presentation, the client, the data he had shaped, not fabricated, he was careful to say that, but shaped, interpreted in directions that supported the conclusion he had been hired to reach, in ways that turned out to be more selective than defensible. He told them about the morning the managing partner called him in, the meeting that lasted 11 minutes, the walk to his car through the parking garage where he sat for 2 hours because he couldn't think of anywhere else to go. He told Savannah, and this was the part that cost him the most, Dorothy could hear it in the way his voice changed registers, about the months of leaving the apartment every morning in his work clothes, the coffee shops, the library on Ponce de Leon where he had set up at a corner table and submitted applications and tried to project, to himself and to the empty air around him, that this was temporary and manageable, and would resolve itself before anyone who mattered found out. He told her about the money, the loans from friends, the ring, the car payments he had stopped making when his savings finally ran out, and he had to choose between the appearance of success and the infrastructure of it. And he told her, looking mostly at the table, about the moment Dorothy offered to pay for the wedding, and how he had felt two things at once. Enormous relief, because the money solved an immediate and desperate problem, and something uglier underneath it, something he had not wanted to examine directly. Shame. The specific shame of a man who has built his identity around being capable and self-sufficient, and finds himself taking his mother's money to fund the performance of being capable and self-sufficient in front of the people whose opinion he had decided mattered most. And instead of sitting with that shame, Dorothy said quietly when he paused, "You moved it." He looked up. "You moved it onto me," she said. It was easier to tell yourself, and Savannah, and her family, that I was the problem, that I was the one who couldn't let go, who used money to control, who needed to be managed. If I was the controlling one, you were just someone asserting healthy boundaries. If I was the overbearing one, you were just protecting your marriage. The shame had somewhere to go. That wasn't you. The silence in the room had weight. Savannah was looking at Elijah with an expression Dorothy recognized. Not anger, not yet, but the particular look of someone whose map of a territory has just been redrawn and who is trying to understand which landmarks still apply. "I know," Elijah said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know that's what I did." "Did you know you were doing it at the time?" A long pause. "Not completely. I told myself I was protecting the relationship. I told myself Savannah's family had certain expectations and I was just managing context. But somewhere underneath that," he stopped. "I knew," Dorothy nodded. She had spent enough time in rooms with people being honest to recognize when it was actually happening. She looked at her son, this man who had her husband's shoulders and her own eyes, who had climbed that oak tree in the front yard until he was 11 years old, who had cried for 3 days when Leonard died and then stopped crying entirely and never really started again. And she felt something she hadn't expected to feel tonight. Not forgiveness, not yet. That was a different conversation for a different season, but something adjacent to it, something that had to do with recognition. She could see him clearly now, without the architecture of the false wall in the way. And what she saw was not a villain. What she saw was a frightened man who had made the choices frightened men make, and who was sitting at his mother's dinner table, telling the truth about them. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a beginning, but it was not the end of tonight's conversation. Dorothy stood and walked to the small writing desk near the window. Leonard's desk, the one he had used to draft his early business plans while she graded papers at the kitchen table, and opened the top drawer. She removed 2 documents and brought them back to the table. She placed the first one in front of Elijah. He looked at it. His face changed. It was a copy of a loan application, one of 2, that Raymond Okafor had flagged earlier that week, the one carrying a forged signature. Raymond received a call from the bank on Thursday, Dorothy said. The first loan is 4 months behind on interest payments. When the bank contacted the secondary signatory listed on the account, which is listed as me, they reached Brianna, who told them I had no such account. They faxed the signature confirmation. It does not match mine. The room was absolutely silent. Elijah, Savannah said. Not a question, just his name, in a voice that had gone completely flat. There are 2 applications, Dorothy continued. $62,000 and $53,000. Both carry my name as co-signatory. I did not sign either of them. She placed the second document on the table. Raymond's preliminary legal assessment. 2 pages, the relevant passages marked in red. Using someone's identity to secure credit without their knowledge or consent is a federal offense, Dorothy said. Raymond has outlined the exposure, civil and criminal, in that summary. I'd like you to read it. Elijah did not pick up the paper. He was looking at his mother with the expression of a man watching the last exit disappear behind him. Mom? Read it, Elijah. He read it. Savannah read it over his shoulder. When they finished, neither of them spoke. Then Savannah stood and walked to the window, the same window Dorothy had stood at Sunday night, looking at the oak tree, and stood there with her back to the room. Elijah, her voice was careful in the way of someone exercising very deliberate restraint. Tell me you didn't do this. He didn't answer. Tell me, she said again, and this time the control cracked slightly at the edges, that you did not forge your mother's signature on a federal loan application. He stopped. I was going to pay it back. Both of them. Once I had the position at Caldwell and Pierce, once I had income again, I had a repayment plan. That is not what I asked you. He put his hands flat on the table. Yes, he said. I did. Savannah turned from the window. Dorothy watched her daughter-in-law's face in that moment and saw something unexpected. Not just anger, not just betrayal, but a specific kind of grief. The grief of someone who has discovered that the story they were living was a different story than the one they thought. I have to go, Savannah said. Not to Elijah, to Dorothy. I'm sorry. I can't sit here right now. I need to think. Of course, Dorothy said. Can I call you? You can always call me. Savannah picked up her bag. She walked past Elijah without touching him. Not with coldness, Dorothy thought, but with the careful distance of someone who doesn't trust their own steadiness. She paused at the doorway. Mrs. Washington, she said. Dorothy said. Please. Something moved across Savannah's face. Dorothy, I'm sorry. For all of it. For Sunday. For the things I repeated. For not asking. She stopped. I should have asked. You'll know to ask now, Dorothy said gently. That's not nothing. Savannah nodded once and left. The front door opened and closed. A car started in the driveway. Dorothy and Elijah sat in the dining room with the good china and the half-empty coffee cups and the 2 legal documents between them. What happens now? Elijah said. His voice had the quality of someone who has set down something very heavy and isn't sure what to do with their hands. That depends on you, Dorothy said. Are you going to? He stopped. Press charges. I haven't decided. He nodded slowly. Raymond and I are meeting Tuesday, Dorothy continued. There are several ways to handle this legally. Some protect both of us from unnecessary exposure. All of them require your full cooperation and complete transparency about everything you've borrowed and from whom. I'll cooperate, he said. Whatever you need. I know you will. She said it without sarcasm. Because that's the person you actually are, underneath the person you've been pretending to be. The pretending is what got us here. The honesty is what gets us out. He was quiet. Then, I don't know how to be real with you. The honesty of it stopped her. She hadn't expected that. Not the fact of it, because on some level she had known it for years, but the fact that he said it out loud. What does that mean? She asked. It means, he looked for words with the careful effort of someone working in a language they understand but don't speak easily. You were never not okay. You lost Dad and you kept going. You took over a company you'd never run, and you built it into something extraordinary. You never fell apart. You never needed anything. I never once saw you not know what to do." Dorothy looked at her son for a long moment. "Elijah, do you know how many times I cried in parking garages between 2005 and 2008? He blinked. "No. Because you were not in the car with me. Because you had already lost your father, and I was not going to let you watch me fall apart too." She said it evenly, without accusation. "That was my choice. I own it. But the consequence of that choice, and I am only fully understanding this tonight, is that I taught you that the standard for being okay was never showing when you weren't." He stared at her. "I didn't know how to fail in front of you," he said slowly, "because I never saw you fail." "I failed constantly," Dorothy said. "I just did it in parking garages." Something loosened in his face. Not resolution. Nothing was resolved tonight, and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. But something shifted. Some weight that had been sitting in the wrong place began slightly to move. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know. Not just for the loans. For all of it. For what I said about you. For letting them—" "I know, Elijah." She said it clearly, not dismissing it but containing it, the way you contain something important, to keep it from spilling before it's ready to be held properly. "We're going to spend a long time on all of it. Tonight, we're just going to start." She walked him to the door at 10:30. On the front porch, under the oak tree that had given up its last leaves to the October wind, he turned back. "The job at Caldwell and Pierce," he said. "Did you do that for me?" Dorothy considered the question seriously, because he was asking it seriously. "I did it because you're qualified and they need someone qualified," she said. "And I did it because you need a place to prove something to yourself that has nothing to do with me. Both of those things are true at the same time." "What if I'm not good enough?" "Then you'll learn what you need to learn, and you'll get better. That's what not being good enough is for." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way she hadn't felt him look at her in a long time, without the screen of the false wall between them. "You were always this," he said. "Everything you are. I just couldn't see it." "You weren't ready to see it," Dorothy said. "That's different from it not being there." She hugged him. He held on longer than she expected. She let him. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright in the porch light, and she remembered with sudden complete clarity what he had looked like at 14, standing at the door of Leonard's hospital room, trying to decide if he was allowed to cry. "Go home," she said gently. "Call Savannah. And Elijah, whatever she needs right now, you give it to her. Even if it's space. Especially if it's space. You show up the way you should have been showing up." He nodded, went to his car, drove away. Dorothy stood on the porch until his taillights disappeared around the corner. The oak tree moved in the wind above her. The night smelled like autumn and wood smoke from somewhere down the street. She went inside and washed the good china by hand, the way she always did, and put it away piece by piece in the cabinet that had held it for 36 years. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, a number of things happened. Raymond Okafor and Elijah met twice. The outcome was an agreement in which Elijah acknowledged the full extent of the fraudulent applications in a signed document held in Raymond's office and committed to a repayment schedule, drawn from his salary at Caldwell and Pierce, that would retire the full amount, plus interest, over 7 years. Dorothy absorbed the immediate bank liability to protect her credit rating. There were no criminal charges. There would be no criminal charges, provided the repayment schedule was honored without exception. Raymond had negotiated the terms with the precision and lack of sentimentality of a man who had known Dorothy Washington for 30 years and understood that mercy and accountability were not, in her worldview, opposites. Elijah started at Caldwell and Pierce on a Wednesday. George introduced him to the team with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided that cooperation was the smartest available strategy. By the end of his first week, 2 of the senior project managers had used the word sharp in separate conversations about him. Dorothy had not asked for that information. Brianna provided it anyway. "Don't tell me again," Dorothy said. "Understood," Brianna said. "He did well." "Brianna," stopping now. The board presentation happened on a Tuesday. Dorothy presented the 90-day operational review plan with Arthur Bellingham at her left, and George, visibly, effortfully composed, at her right. 3 board members asked substantive questions. The other 4 listened with the quality of attention that meant they had already made up their minds, and what they had made up their minds about was that DM Washington knew what she was doing. The vote to approve the plan was 6-1. George abstained. After the meeting, as the board members filed out, George stopped beside Dorothy in the emptying room. "The benefits package," he said. "When will the rollout be complete?" "January 1st, full coverage, all 200 employees. Retroactive claims processing begins December 15th. He was quiet for a moment. "You mentioned one employee had been with us for 16 years, he said. "Margaret Tilson. She's in accounts receivable." He nodded slowly, the nod of someone absorbing something they should have known and didn't. "I'll tell her personally," he said, "before the general announcement. She should hear it from me directly." Dorothy looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "She should." Something shifted in George Caldwell's face in that moment. Not transformation, not redemption, nothing so dramatic or so fast. Just a small, quiet recalibration. A man of 61 years taking in a piece of information about himself and deciding, for reasons he probably couldn't fully articulate, to do something different. A few days later, Brianna mentioned that Arthur Bellingham had reported George had sat down across from Margaret Tilson at her desk and told her himself. He had not sent an email. He had not delegated it. He had gone to her desk. Dorothy found she was glad. Vivian called once on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the dinner. She didn't ask about the company. She asked about Savannah. Dorothy appreciated the precision of that Vivian had understood, without being told, which question was the right one to ask. "She's finding her footing," Dorothy said. "Give her time." "She's stronger than she looks," Vivian said. "I know," Dorothy said. "I noticed." Savannah called on a Sunday morning in the quiet of early November. Not to report, not to negotiate, not to manage anything. She called because she had been walking through the High Museum of Art the day before and stopped in front of a Carrie James Marshall painting, a large one, a figure rendered in deep blue-black against a luminous background, and stood there for 20 minutes without entirely understanding why. Then she had gone home, looked up the name on the label, and sat with what she found for a long time. "I stood in front of it and I couldn't move," she said. "They require that," Dorothy said. "His paintings. They don't give up what they are quickly. The one in your living room, that one's from 1997. He wasn't yet what he became, but you could already see it coming if you knew how to look." A pause. "I'd like to see it again, if you'd be willing." "Come for coffee," Dorothy said. "Sunday after next. Come alone." "Okay." A breath. "Dorothy?" "Yes." "How are you doing, actually?" Dorothy considered the question the way she considered all genuine questions, seriously, without deflection, because the person asking deserved the real answer. "I'm doing the thing I should have done a long time ago," she said. "I'm figuring out what I want." "What do you want?" "I'll let you know when I've finished figuring it out." A pause. "But I'll tell you one thing. I'm sleeping better." Savannah laughed. It was the first time Dorothy had heard her laugh without the performance in it. It was a good laugh, surprised and completely real. "I'm glad," Savannah said. On a Thursday afternoon in early December, gray sky, the smell of coming rain over Atlanta, Dorothy sat at her desk on the 27th floor of the Washington Legacy Building and looked at the view her husband had always said they would have one day. "One day we'll have an office where we can see the whole city," he had said in 1991, standing in their first office space, 400 square feet above a dry cleaner on Cascade Road, looking out at a parking lot and the back of a grocery store. She could see the whole city now. Brianna knocked and came in with the end-of-day summary, a habit they had developed over 12 years, one Dorothy suspected she would keep until she retired, however many years from now that turned out to be. "The Q4 projections from Caldwell and Pierce are in your inbox," Brianna said. "They're better than the Q3 actuals." "I'll read them tonight." "And Elijah called." A pause. "He said he didn't need anything. He just wanted to know if you'd eaten lunch." Dorothy stopped. She set down her pen. "He called to ask if I'd eaten lunch," she said. "Those were his exact words. I told him I didn't have visibility into your lunch habits. He said to tell you to eat something. Dorothy looked out at the city. The clouds were moving in from the northwest, the way they always did before a serious rain, turning the light that particular flat gray that made the buildings look drawn in pencil. Tell him I had the soup from the place on Peachtree, she said. The one he likes? The one he likes. Brianna made a note and moved toward the door. Brianna, Dorothy said. She turned. Did you eat? Brianna smiled. The full version, not the professional one. Yes, ma'am, I did. Good. Go home. In 20 minutes. Go home, Brianna. A small pause. 15 minutes. Dorothy shook her head and turned back to the window. The rain began. First the smell of it, then the sound, then the gray curtain of it moving across Peachtree Street below, the headlights of evening traffic blurring in the wet. She watched the city she had grown up in, the city she had built something in, the city that had not always made room for her and that she had occupied anyway. Quietly, completely, with the patience of a woman who understood that presence outlasts resistance, every time. She thought about Leonard. She thought about the note. You know how to do this, you just haven't believed it yet. And about how she had read it at 44 as an instruction, and now at 63 understood it was something different. It wasn't an instruction, it was a description. He had seen her clearly, the way you sometimes only see a person clearly when you are running out of time to look, and he had written down what he saw. She had spent nearly 20 years trying to deserve the description. It had taken a Tuesday night in October, at a wedding she had paid for, being dismissed by a woman who didn't know her, to understand that she had deserved it all along. Not because of the $400 million, not because of the 43 buildings, because of who she had been in every parking garage, every 5-minute window of feeling, every 2 a.m. at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a problem to solve and nobody watching. She had been that woman all along. She opened the small silver locket. Leonard laughing. Reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Some joke off camera, some moment of uncomplicated joy, preserved in a photograph barely larger than a postage stamp. I figured it out, she told him. The rain moved across the city. It just took me a minute. She closed the locket, put it back in her purse, turned to her computer and opened the Caldwell and Pierce Q4 projections. Dorothy Mae Washington had work to do. She always did. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like exactly enough. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you know or someone you are, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, just remember this. The room you make for yourself is the one that lasts. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories coming, and I don't want you to miss a single one.